Hey guys, so today I wanted to talk about something that has been on my mind for a bit of time, especially since Figma came out with constraints. That idea is top-down, bottom-up, and sibling relationships. What I mean by that is dependencies of parents on their children, dependencies of children on their parents' containers, and dependencies of sibling objects, so objects within the same group to each other. So the first one I want to demonstrate is what we already have and use in Figma, which is constraints. So if I select this orange box, this is set to stretch. So stretch horizontally and stretch vertically. This green one is set to left stretch. This blue one is set to stretch bottom. This yellow one is set to stretch center. Purple one is set to right bottom, and so on. So now if I select this parent container, this frame, and if I resize this, you can see that the children object inside of this parent frame will change form based on the rules of how they're supposed to adapt to their parent container. So if I stretch it this way or this way, they all sort of form to the parent container. Now, I wanted to I wanted to talk about a different idea, which, if this one is top-down relationship, so that the parent dictating the form of its children, I wanted to explore the idea of bottom-up relationships as well. So that's where the children dictate the shape of their parent. So the second one is just that. So if I turn on this checkbox, you can see that the second type of constraint has been turned on, which is now set to 0, 0, 0, 0. So the parent container, which just was sort of sitting there loose, now actually hugs its children objects, because this is set to 0 padding top, right, bottom, and left, just like in CSS. Now, if I go to the advanced settings here, find something familiar to what we see in constraints as we have it today. And this solid gray line is the object that we're actually dealing with, and the dotted gray line is the object or objects that it will be relative to. So these are the children. And right now they're all set to 0, 0, 0, 0. And I might just select, or I might just type 40 for each of these. So now we have a 40 pixel buffer around the boundary of the children. And I can set these to be whatever I want to be, whatever I want them to be. Now if I increase the size of this yellow box, you see that the parent container actually increases its width to still maintain that 40 pixel buffer from here. If I take these two objects and I move them down, same thing happens. The parent resizes to the children. Now I want to take this a step further and actually talk about sibling relationships. And that's exactly what this third row here is. So what I'm going to do is, after having selected this parent frame, I'm going to select from here stack children top, and I can also stack children bottom, left, and right. But for the purpose of this one, we're going to do top. And what happens immediately, I'm showing this to you over time, but it would obviously happen instantaneously. What would happen is that the objects stack from the top to the bottom depending on their Y value. So you see here that both orange and yellow have the same Y value, so they both stayed at the same level. But then red, which is the next one down, its Y value is the Y value of orange plus orange's height. The Y value of green is red's Y value plus its height, and so on. Now I can actually just left align this to show you more closely what's happening. If I zoom in to this area and move yellow 1 pixel down, what would happen instantly is that because now yellow has a higher Y value than orange, it would reorder. The parent container would reorder its children, and now you'd have yellow appearing after orange. And just to make this even more useful, you could have actual spacing rules for in between the children. So I might want to add 20 pixels of padding between each of these. Or I could even have a negative integer and they would overlap. So these are a few things that I think would be really useful. And I want to show you a few examples of where I would actually use them. So in my day-to-day work, as I'm designing UIs, a lot of the work that I'm doing relies on many nested objects and frames. Just like in web development, you have divs. I use frames in a very similar way. And it relies on their sort of dependency on one another. So let's say I wanted to go and change one very simple thing. I wanted to maybe say, the objects in this group have a 16 or a 12 pixel boundary between them and their parent container. So I might want this to be a little bit higher. Maybe I want more of more breathability. I want a more parse spacing. So what I would do in this scenario is, because I have all of these vertically centered as a constraint, all I would need to do is go and add, so we're going from 12 to 16, top and bottom, that's 8. So just adding 8, and now I have 16 pixels above and below. But now the real work begins. And this is where I have to actually, to make everything else align, first I need to increase that and that and that. So now each of these have 16 pixels to their children. But now I have to take this frame and reposition the children. So move that down by 8 pixels, move that down, move that down. And the way I actually have mine set up is that this parent folder, or the parent container, has a gray background, and each of the layers have just a white background. So what essentially happens is that you see the gray peeking through the back. And this actually is just a little thing that I started doing recently, because it makes it allows you to have the rule lines be independent of the actual list items, but that's a slight deviation. But anyway, so now I've changed that frame, and now this frame needs to update to. It's a little tricky here. So now that frame adjusts, and then this frame adjusts to that. But now I want to keep that value, so now it's a little confusing because of what was it? So 8 plus 8 plus 8 plus 8. So I actually now have to move everything below this down by 32 pixels. So now I have to highlight all of this and move down by 1, 2, 3. Whoops, something's locked. Okay, so again, just going here and, oops, as you can see, it's not the lightest amount of work. There we go. So now I've selected everything below there, and okay, anyway, you get the point. I have to move this down by 32 points. 1, 2, 3. And it's just kind of annoying. It takes a lot of work that it's a lot of time that I'm spending not really being creative or designing, but just maintaining the design. So when you're actually working with these kinds of components in context of the page that they work within, it's I find that a great design tool to me is one that allows you to experiment and make really big changes that you couldn't make easily in code, and immediately see how they look before your eyes, and with direct manipulation. But when I have to start when I start to think about this big overhead resulting in any little change, like a slight line padding increase, then I become more. I have more reservations about actually experimenting and making changes, and that's not really a good thing. So Sketch actually already has tools that kind of do this. They are plugins, so they're not going to be as well integrated into the design tool as something like Constraints is in Figma. But here's the idea. I have a primary and secondary line in my row, and there's a 8-pixel spacing between these two. Now let's say I want to make the secondary row text slightly smaller. So instead of 20/24, I'm going to go 16/20. And now to adjust this, I need to move this 3 pixels up. And because this had a 20-pixel all-around padding, I'm using dynamic button. I'm just going to select this and use the dynamic button plugin, which is Command J, to adjust all the row heights. And now I have an extra 4 pixels of space between each of these. And where right now in Figma I have to manually move them one by one, here I can just go to another plugin called Stack Children. And now it'll make sure that the value between everything vertically is 0. Now, if I wanted to, I could go into the script file and change that value to be 1 or 10 or 20 or whatever I want. But it's not as nice of an experience as just being able to access it in your toolbar, in your inspector. Another example so that was an example of the sibling relationships. Example of the bottom-up relationship is, again, the dynamic button tool, which I do use for buttons, and it can change your button size to be whatever you, always relative to the object. So sorry, the background shape to be always relative to the object. So here I have 1816, which is 18 pixels top down and 16 pixels left right. But I use it for a lot more than buttons, as you can see. You can use it for you can just compound it layer within layer within layer, and it's not the best experience because every time you change something, you have to select each layer and you have to press Command J to update it, which is again an opportunity for Figma to have something that is really integrated and just does everything on the fly automatically without the designer having to manually change each thing. So just kind of going back to those things that we talked about, we already have top-down relationships, which is constraints. Bottom-up relationships would have the parent container adapt to the size of its children, and then potentially even allow additional padding around. And then sibling relationships would be a way to order the elements based on a y value or an x value, depending on whether it's top, left, bottom, right, and then even have spacing in between those children objects. And one other thing that I didn't have a mock-up for, but wanted to also mention was it would be really great if, maybe this is a setting that the user can turn on and off at a global level, but it'd be really great if objects inside of a group could actually be ordered in the layer palette based on the way that they're stacked, if they are stacked. So orange would be the first thing in the group, and then yellow and red and so on. And the reason why this would be really useful is because if I was working on a UI and I wanted to switch up the order of some objects on a screen, I wouldn't even have to go into here to rearrange them. I could just rearrange them in the layer inspector, and they would automatically change here based on that rule once this is turned on. So yeah, I'm sort of talked about this before in a previous video, but I wanted to put this out in front of the Figma community and get your thoughts. Is this something that you think would actually make your workflow better? Are these the kinds of things that you find yourself doing redundantly over and over again? Or is this really not a big deal? Is this something that you kind of have a workaround with or don't really fuss too much over? I'd love to know what everyone thinks about this. Also, in terms of thinking about shared assets, I think that what would make shared assets even more scalable is having these kinds of relationships be inherent in the way that we create assets. So that, for example, if I have an object that is shared and people place that in their UIs, if I change the size of that object slightly and they have their containers, adapting to the children, then it wouldn't break the layout theoretically, because it's sort of set up in a way where it's able to adapt to changing sizes. Whereas in the current model, everything would have to stay very much kind of rigid in the size that it's at. Otherwise, if someone else changes something slightly, it would totally break all designs. So yeah, that's about it. Would love to hear your thoughts and ideas about this. Thanks for listening.